Allan's ideas about his tribe, about his family. He brought them to life.
The fact that he was Native American was so basic.
He was an artist. He spent all his time doing art.
As I grew up, I realized he could do anything he wanted to do. He was just so talented.
He's the most widely recognized and probably ever will be Native American artist.
In 1913, after 27 years of imprisonment, the United States government released the Chiricahua Apaches from Fort Sill in Oklahoma. A generation lost, these emancipated prisoners of war found themselves starting anew. The first child born into freedom would be named Allan Haozous, better known in the art world as Allan Hauser. It would become his life's work and the legacy of his family to ensure that the Apache way of life would never be forgotten.
Human dignity is very important to me. I feel that way towards all people, not just Indians. In my work, this is what I strive for, this dignity, this goodness that is in man. I hope I am getting it across. If I am, then I'm doing what I've always wanted.
The Haozous family is the best known of all the Apache families, certainly. Much through Allan's role as an artist, but also through Sam's role in exemplifying that spirit of being unconquered, being able to adapt. The Apaches were nearly exterminated. The family symbolizes that strength and that adaptability, and also the pride and the recognition of what their heritage is and what their roots are.
Allan's father, Sam Haozous, spent the better part of his first 15 years learning the traditions of his Apache people. He was a descendant of the great Apache chief, Mangus Coloradas, a nephew to Geronimo. It was Sam's shared memories of hunting game, family experience, and tribal survival that would become the soul of his son's art.
It's one family, an Apache American family, that has these influences of Sam Haozous, who was captured as a prisoner of war and brought here, says, you will live in Oklahoma, not by choice, but because you are a defeated nation. You will live here as a POW. But he adapts, he changes. The oral traditions that he got from the descendants of Mangus Coloradas and Geronimo and the other Apaches come to Oklahoma with Sam and his wife, Blossom. Those stories are shared with Allan and his siblings and his cousins and the next generation, Bob and Philip. And then taking those memories and showing how one unique family has expressed that through art.
With Allan, when he let something out of the studio, when it was ready, it was 100% complete.
His themes are of nobility and of the future and of that wonderful bond that his people and the stories that he'd heard, how he portrays that with either the land or with buffalo or with each other as a family.
And there was never any discussion or even thought about it. He'd come to the studio, he'd go to work.
Well, he had powerful hands, you know. It wasn't so much power. That's where the spirituality, I think, of his creativity came in, because he would just, like, he could take a piece of clay and just and make it work.
I could never turn away from my history. The strength that I have is my pride in who I am.
There is no angst in Allan Hauser's work, in spite of the incredible genocide that happened to his family and to his people.
In 1848, with the end of the Mexican-American War, coupled with the discovery of gold in the Southwest, a flood tide of pioneers and miners encroached upon Apache lands, leading to inevitable skirmishes.
The Apaches were nearly exterminated. Chiricahuas went from thousands and thousands of people, part of the tribe, down to a few hundred.
Faced with the onslaught of Western expansion and threats to their way of life, many Apaches would take up the fight. One such warrior was Geronimo.
He realized that the only way to try to maintain their lands against the onslaught of the Americans was to attack any individuals that would be found on their land.
On September 4th, 1886, after evading 5,000 federal troops for over a year, Geronimo and his small band surrendered to General Nelson Miles at Skeleton Canyon, Arizona. Under the terms of the unconditional surrender, all Chiricahua Apaches were to be taken as prisoners of war.
When they were captured, they were placed on trains, so they were considered prisoners. They were placed in boxcars, much like what the Nazis did to the Jewish people during the Holocaust.
Approximately 450 Chiricahua Apaches were transported to Florida. Geronimo and his warriors were taken to Fort Pickens, while the rest of the tribe, mainly women, children, and the elderly, were taken to Fort Marion. Appalling conditions led to tuberculosis and death, thus prompting another move the next year to Mount Vernon Barracks in Alabama. But the health of the tribe did not improve.
Everyone realized this was not good, could not continue because they were dying like flies in Florida and Alabama.
Eventually, they were moved to Fort Sill in southwest Oklahoma.
Fort Sill became a turning point for the tribe. They were allotted land to farm crops and raise cattle. 19 years passed, and the once battle-worthy warriors grew old. So when Geronimo died, and when the U.S. Army wanted to build an artillery school at Fort Sill, they looked no further than the land occupied by the Chiricahua Apache.
The decision was made by the Apaches themselves as to who would go, who would stay.
On April 2nd, 1913, after 27 years of imprisonment, 176 Chiricahua Apaches left for a reservation in Mescalero, New Mexico. 88 stayed behind and were eventually allotted land in and around Apache, Oklahoma. Two of the Apaches who stayed to make a life as farmers were Sam and Blossom Haozous.
I think most of my themes for my painting and sculpture derive from the stories that were told to me by my father and the hardships that my father and mother had gone through.
They were on the reservation at Fort Apache, and they were called in for a count, and they said the soldiers, the scouts, rode in a big circle around them, and everybody who was inside that circle had to leave.
My grandfather, Sam Haozous, was, we figure he was around 15 or 16 years old when he went to prison.
They were moved to Fort Sill in 1894, which was the year after my grandmother was born. My grandmother, Blossom, was the daughter of one of the Apaches who was a prisoner of war, Annie White.
Of course, you know how they were taken down to Florida and how they were 27 years. I just can't believe that they would do that.
The thing that makes my tribe so great is not this fantasy about warriors or family or cultural ways or the physical culture. It's really the fact that we lived in the most harsh place in the world and we thrived.
They held on to their traditions, their stories, and their way of life.
We lived in the grandfather's house, a house that he refused to sleep in for years after he got married because he's used to sleeping outside.
Living on the farm, my grandfather was a deputy sheriff, and my grandmother was always taking care of everybody.
Sam would tell stories from way back. Instead of having written them down, well, he would tell them, you know.
I used to sit on his lap all the time until he got too old. They said, you can't sit on his lap anymore. And I remember sitting, hearing he and Blossom singing, and people coming and doing back and forth and different dances and mountain spirit dances in the front yard.
It's interesting to see the photographs of him as a baseball player, as a tennis player, as a cowboy, as a soldier.
Short, strong, stout, but athlete. He was an old man when I knew him, but always joking with Blossom. They're always joking about everything.
Sometimes my grandparents would sit on the front porch of the house there and sing songs and tell stories, and my grandfather would play his flute. When my grandfather would tell these stories, my grandmother would translate them because he would mostly in Apache.
These people would come and he'd sing a song and they'd start to cry because they'd never heard it. They hadn't heard it since the imprisonment.
No one was more fascinated and deeply influenced with these oral traditions than Sam and Blossom's oldest son, Allan. He would sketch Apache scenes on lined school paper, or, much to his mother's dismay, carve them into a good bar of soap.
They have listened to the mountains. They have listened to the animals. They have listened to the plants rooted in the earth. The spirit of the song, the spirit of the drum have carried them. If you put a part of yourself in the mountain, then the mountain becomes a part of you and stays in your heart and your mind wherever you go. Maybe that's why they call us the people of the mountain.
We were out at the sculpture studio one day, and he had some guests show up, and they wanted to see what he was doing. And he said, "Well, I'm working on a piece right here," and he had a stone on a pedestal, and he was trying to explain to us what he was trying to tell us, you know, in his mind. And he took one of those black crayons, and he just said, "Well, I want to take some off here," and he just did a little line, and then he took. Kind of walked and looked at it, and then he did another one. You know, we were just kind of watching. And he says, "Then I'm going to take some off here." And he goes like this, and this face of this woman came out, just looking at us.
In 1934, Allan was with his parents at the Indian Affairs Office in Anadarko, Oklahoma. He noticed a flyer on the bulletin board announcing the establishment of an art class at the Santa Fe Indian School. Telling no one, he sent in a few of his raw sketches, and weeks later found out that he was accepted. Allan was 20 years old.
His father was not very pleased. His best hand, his oldest boy, who he counted on taking over the farm, was going to go off and be a painter.
Allan's tenure at school was both eye-opening and frustrating. While he was taught basic technique, his teacher, Dorothy Dunn, a non-Indian, believed Indians should be painting specific to their own tribe. There would be no outside influences and no real study of art history. The results were often flat and one-dimensional with little scope beyond what the non-Indian audience expected from an Indian painter.
When he finished school, he was on Garcia Street. He and a friend of his rented a place so they can live, and they were painting. He took his all his drawings down to Gallup, and he sold all of them, 22,000. So I thought, he's really good. He shouldn't be just doing menial work or things like that, you know.
Times were often hard for the struggling young artist who was newly married and starting a family back in Oklahoma. Allan relied even more on the narratives of his parents for inspiration, including one Apache folk hero that Allan held close to his heart.
This is Allan Haozous.
He had a spot on the radio singing a Western. He called himself the Apache Kid.
Allan had a copy of this photograph he was looking at when he did the Apache Kid, and it was completely different than the work that he had been trained in the Dorothy Dunn School. And it's a painting with a landscape in the background that had some depth and distance to it, a little narrative in the background, where the Dorothy Dunn paintings were, you know, by the nature of the formula of them, were be very flat.
We have to stand and stand our ground. This is ours. Apache Kid was one of these, and he was a very psychic leader, and he could foretell the future. He could see the enemy coming days in advance. When they rounded up the Apaches to take him to prison, he slipped away somehow and had a ranch in Mexico and had 20 Mexicans working for him. And everybody thought that was really great.
During World War II, Allan found himself working in war-related construction. It wasn't until after the war that Allan would get his big break. He was informed about a design competition for a war memorial that was to be built at the Haskell Institute in Lawrence, Kansas, to honor all fallen Indian soldiers. Allan submitted his ideas and won the competition. He assured the jury that he was indeed well-versed in sculpting large marble, but the truth was that he had no formal training as a sculptor.
They brought him to stone and they put him down in the basement and gave him the tools, jackhammers, and I don't know what else. And he did it. He finished it. Beautiful piece, you know. Yeah. He was very proud of it.
Despite his lack of experience and the absence of proper tools, he transformed a massive block of Carrara marble into the captivating 7-foot-tall statue entitled Comrade in Mourning. It was his first true sculpture. It would not be his last.
And there was a tourist a man came by, and he nudged him and he said, "Chief, how would you like to have done that?" And Allan said, "Oh, yeah."
People say, what do you want to remember about your father?
He was great, you know, wrestling around with us and tickling. And
It's so easy to think, oh, he's a great artist and he did this, or he's an athlete. But I remember him always joking.
there was always something going on.
He'd sketch, get the napkins, you know, and sketch.
He'd be over there and make these little paper figures. He'd bend paper different ways and make little forms and set them on the table, and then hit them with his finger and they'd jump, you know.
Maybe the waitress would say, "Oh, I like this," or throw them out.
And they'd jump, and we'd be sitting there watching him. He'd be playing with these things, jumping around on the table.
The ideas come through sketching before working up my ideas in clay, wax, or plaster. In my books of sketches, you will see the many directions that I prefer to explore. What makes art exciting, I believe, is the ability to experiment.
I think an individual sculpture, again, was a culmination often of years. I think he kept it fresh, that every piece was in a way a new piece that he was doing. He was trying to say something new.
And he doesn't portray scenes of violence. He doesn't really reflect a warrior culture, which was obviously in existence and which his father had been born into. But he was an optimist, and without any bitterness, he portrayed what he knew of his family and what he knew of his culture and what he knew of the culture that had been lost in a most amazing way.
It was the aspect that made him special, that made him that 1 in 10 million artist, was the degree of perfection.
There aren't really any self-portraits, which is unusual for an artist. But Mrs. Haozous, his wife Anne-Marie, says that if you look into the faces of the little boys, actually that's where you'll see Allan. You'll see those faces with a smile on the face, a little grin, a little cheeky grin, and apparently that's Allan. Allan, although he had no real mainstream classical art training, really amazingly turned to some of the most classic forms and the classic compositions, whether it's the mother and the child, or whether it's that far distant yearning and the look into the distance and that nobility, particularly with his women, the way that he portrays women, whether they're mothers or younger children.
A lot of times, if you were looking at me in the studio, you'd see how calm I am and quiet, and you wouldn't hear a sound because I'm trying to feel like the mother.
By the early 1960s, Allan had become well known in the art world, so when the Institute of American Indian Arts was formed in Santa Fe, the first to be asked to join the faculty was Allan Haozous.
He really passed on something, and he gave them an opportunity to liberate themselves. He gave them an opportunity to tell their own stories.
Unlike Dorothy Dunn, Allan wanted his students to experiment in the hope that they would fully develop their own individual artistic style. He continued to teach until 1975, and it would be through the freedom of retirement that Allan himself would come into full bloom as an artist.
When my father retired, he always worked, and there was never a discussion or even thought about it. He'd come to the studio, he'd go to work.
And he didn't even think about it, he just did it. You'll see that more in his charcoal drawing. I used to go in and watch him, and he'd take a piece of charcoal and just make a line and look at it, and then a little bit here and there. And you can see this figure just start to grow, and it was really nice to watch.
Inspiration derived from the stories of his parents laid the foundation for much of Allan's artwork. A generation later, these themes are still evident in the art of his sons.
Allan is going to express himself in romantic, lyrical, poetic ways. Philip, although different, shares some of that. It's very poetic. It has a certain balance and symmetry, soft flowing lines.
At one of my shows, I heard one of the guests saying that Philip has kind of taken over where Allan left off. And I thought, that's nice. I like to hear that. I don't want to copy him. I want to be me, and and look towards the future for my design.
Bob, very different, a counterpoint to much of that. His expressions are more abrupt, harsh in some ways, asking questions.
I'm an artist because I have no choice. It's just what I do. That's all. I love what I do. I think it's meaningful. I love what my hands can do and what my mind can do, and I try to put it in an object.
In many ways, they all complement each other. They're searching for belonging and community and a sense of place. They're searching for truth.
This is Great Spirit Buffalo. I started with this size model, and I do them out of clay. And as you can see, it's realistic on one side, and then I have a kind of my own abstract, modern look on this side. I thought it would work really well when it was in a large size. So they'll pull a wax out of that mold, and we send them off to companies that do enlargements by laser cutting foam, and then we'll seal it so we can apply clay to it. And that's what happened with this one here.
My steel work came directly from the inherent power of steel. And sometimes I even make these things, attachments on my pieces. And I let it sit. I let a piece sit for 15 years, my last stone piece. And then last year I said, I'm gonna finish it. I'm ready. So it's really, I adapt daily. Creative inspiration is always there's no blank spot. It's always there, always something. It's just a matter of how much time do I have to do it, or how much can I spend on it.
They'll take it to the foundry, and then they'll do another mold. And when we get that just where we want it, then it'll go into the foundry process, doing the ceramic shell and the burnout and the pour, and then they'll assemble the metal, the bronze. And then when that's at that point, then I'll go in there and see if everything is just like like I like, and then we'll decide what colors or a combination of colors we use on the patina. On this one, I try to get more of a rusted metal look on one side, and the other side is more of a golden.
Ooh, Apache Holocaust, that has my heart. I love that piece. It's painful. On the base are all the tribes, all Apache people I found from the Indian school registers of mostly people that died. Plus I put all the family names of the tribes in Oklahoma. I tried to, of the families in Oklahoma. And in the column are the 7 generations of the future. All the death, all of what's happened to us, our tribal, cultural knowledge, our philosophical knowledge is almost dead now. And on top is an Apache man. It all turned on him because now they're in a prison camp in a foreign area, and he was going to be killed by his own. And he was deserted by everything he's related to.
Whether it provokes thought or conveys beauty, Philip and Bob's art is influenced by the richness of Apache traditions.
Another time we went to school and I was at the first grade, and the teacher sent a note back. It says he's calling himself Haozous. He has to be taught that he's a Hauser. And my parents sat me down and said, "You're a Hauser. You're not a Haozous anymore." And after they were done, my grandfather took me in the back room. He said, "You'll always be a Haozous." And that really had a profound effect on me, because it meant more than I'm always of the family. It meant I'm of the people.
I just knew that there was something that I had inside me, and I knew I had a sense of design because of my flute making.
That was it. I stuck my spear in the sand and said, this is where I'm going to stand as an artist, and that's where I am.
I have always tried to give the Indian as much pride as I could. I always liked to see my father's face or my mother's face have a feeling of pride when they looked at some of the things I was doing.
We organized our tribe and were recognized by the government. We got per capita payments. I thought, and I'm not going to squander this money. This is special, you know. People died for it. And I thought, well, I'm going to buy some property.
So, with the dream to construct an artist compound the family could call their own, Philip took his father to the desired location.
And he just kind of walked around. He was looking around and picking things up off the ground and looking around. He said, you know, he said, I like this too. He says, I see what you mean. He said, I really like it. Because this was Apache land to start with, and now it's Apache land again.
The seed was planted, and the Allan Haozer compound arose out of the Santa Fe Desert. Complete with galleries, a foundry, and most importantly, a breathtaking sculpture garden, a menagerie of masterpieces that included Allan's art and the legacy of the family as a whole. With this sanctuary, Allan was free to explore and grow as an artist until the very end.
This is a 6,900-pound piece of Carrara marble. It was the only remaining marble left in his studio at the time of his death. Mr. Haozer, like many artists, always wanted to go to the quarries in Italy and select his own stone, just as the great Renaissance sculptors such as Michelangelo had done. In 1991, Allan purchased 19 tons of this beautiful marble. Unfortunately, he was unable to finish this piece, but those who knew him knew that this was his unfinished symphony.
On August 22, 1994, at the age of 80, Allan Haozer passed away. His life's work, like his people, continues to live on, inspiring future artists and generations.
I think as long as we keep showing the pieces and have them in exhibits and do the documentary work and get the word out there and get the images out there and show the Allan Haozer for the man he really was, the power he had and the genius, should never die. It should go on forever.
The impact of the Haozous family has been tremendous and continues to be on today's modern American experience.
We're as valid as Geronimo or Mangus Coloradus or all those people before. But we have to define ourselves. But more important, if we define ourselves by Western standards, then we're kidding ourselves, we romanticize ourselves. What we have to do is find out the essence of our tribe, the philosophical essence that made us Apache. because that's what's going to carry us into the future.
Whether it be Sam as the storyteller who people came from miles around to listen to, or whether he and Blossom singing those wonderful old songs, to Allan as a world-renowned artist, as a teacher who touched tens of thousands of young people, and to this generation, to Bob, to Philip, to the people who carry on those traditions today, that impact will live on.
Now that he's gone, I go out there. I can feel his spirit. I can feel his thinking. I can feel that he's not gone. Maybe I have him in my mind, you know.